Good afternoon, everyone, and I realize I'm the last in your agenda, so thank you for staying. I think I'm the token practitioner, which is perhaps why I'm at the end of the menu rather than at the beginning. When I got to Oslo a couple of days ago, my real intent was to get into the hotel room to shower, sit behind that desk and put together a PowerPoint presentation to go with this very illustrious title that I gave Karen and Linda, which reads Transformation Where the Rubber Hits the Road, the Story of Climate Change Adaptation in Durban. And when I looked at that title again, two words really lifted off the page at me. Firstly, obviously, transformation. And it occurred to me that if we were going to spend several days ensconced with one another talking about transformative change, another PowerPoint presentation probably wasn't the vehicle for it. I mean, how many times have we not died death by PowerPoint? At some point it will become fatal. And given that this is the last session, I determined that I wasn't going to sort of drag you through another PowerPoint presentation. So I freed myself of the need to engage with PowerPoint. Because while I think it's useful, it's often a crutch that we use to talk at people and not with people. So I'm choosing to use my 20 minutes of fame to talk to you, not at you. The second word that left off the page at me was the term story. And for those of you who know Africans, who are Africans, you'll know that we love stories, regardless of our cultural background. We talk about our history in stories, we talk about our worldview in stories, and stories are really important things. I heard someone say a couple of months ago that he who tells the best story will control the 21st century. And to me that struck a real chord, and it struck more and more of a chord as I've watched, listened, and participated over the last couple of days. It's felt a bit like a kind of Wizard of Oz experience. I felt like Dorothy wandering down the yellow brick road. Eventually sort of finding the Emerald City after a sort of gamut of flying monkeys and witches. And then when I draw away the curtain to see where all of this is coming from, I find a little man sort of controlling the levers and gears behind it. And I think that's why stories are powerful, is they allow you to find who's actually behind the curtain. And I suppose that's what I want to do with my time here. Because you can read about Durban in the peer-reviewed press, in the formal reports, so you can read all that boring stuff. What I thought I'd do with my time is tell you some of the inside stories, so the stories behind the stories. And so what I'll do is I'll tell you three stories. One personal, because I think it's very rude to talk about other people if you're not prepared to talk about yourself. And then two stories that relate to our work. So the first story, as I said, is a personal one. I'm a biologist and a chemist by training. Heaven forbid I'm not a geographer. I feel overwhelmed by geographers here. And my passion is Africa's biodiversity. I started off my life as an academic and very rapidly got very tired and frustrated with the huge science policy divide that I saw. And the lack of responsiveness of academia to the practical difficulties that I saw around me. I was very lucky in that the platform for my transformation was provided by the transformation of our country. So our move to democratization created a platform where absolutely anything was possible. There was no wrong or right question. You could bring anything to the table. Because we had to restructure this entire country, this entire society. We had to find a new way of being and relating to one another. And so I decided that was a good time for me to close my door at the university and to go down to local government, which is where I've been for almost 20 years. And that was probably all at once the most insightful move I've ever made. And I've certainly never regretted it. I'm deeply passionate about the work we do at the local government level. But it was also probably the most naive decision I've ever made, because although I had worked alongside local government for many years, I had never worked in it. And local government, once you're in it, is a very different beast. And local government in South Africa at that time was an incredibly conflictual place. It was a place where local councillors wouldn't sit on the same side of a council table if they came from different parties. They were killing each other on the streets. I mean, How many people here have had to wear Kevlar vests to do their field work? I have. And so it was a time of enormous conflict. It was a time when, despite the fact that various political parties were clearly recognizing they had to say something about sustainable development, were driving a development at all costs agenda. There was this huge mass of people who needed houses, they needed jobs, they needed basic services. So for someone like myself, who came into that environment talking about sustainable development and how biodiversity might assist, I was virtually seen as a betrayer of the revolution, as someone who was carrying elitist values into this new social system. So that was incredibly difficult. It was a difficult time. So when climate change came floating into our awareness at the local government level, I basically chuckled and said, you've got to be kidding to think that's important. You know, I'm working in an environment where people are dying on a day-to-day basis, where I've got ecosystems going extinct through land invasions overnight, and you think climate change is a serious problem. So I took climate change very politely and put it at the back of the city's queue. The one good thing, though, about local government is it allows you to take those instantaneous decisions. The bad thing about it is that you don't get a great deal of time to think. And somewhere in this practitioner body lurks a sort of minuscule amount of the original academic. And so I do, on occasion, need quiet times to think and to learn. And so in 2004, I took one of my Aboriginal walkabouts. Every so often I go walking about the world, and I sit somewhere quietly in a sabbatical to think. And in 2004, I took myself off to Brown University, and that quiet, uncontested political time, or uncontested by politics time, allowed me the opportunity to think about climate change science, to understand it. Nothing enchants a scientist more than science. To talk to researchers in the field, and I realized that what I needed to do was take climate change from the back of the city's queue and put it in the front of the queue. And so that teaches us a little bit about why stakeholders are important, because you do get gatekeepers. I'm a gatekeeper in my city. Unless you can persuade me something is useful and valuable, very little will come of it. And so that's a personal reflection on why people are important in this story. So effectively, I got on a plane, I went home, and I said to my team, right, we're going to put in place a municipal climate protection program. And we all sat around a table, and we realized we had no idea what such a thing would look like. We had no idea what the goals and objectives would be. We had no idea how to carry out such a thing. And so we realized it would be a learning by doing experience. It would be very phased, and we would do something, we would make mistakes, and so on. And so the first thing that we did was start where most cities start, and that's undertake an impact assessment. And so like many local government officials around the world, we sat and we fretted over the downscaled models, and we fretted over the IPCC scenarios. And eventually, at the end of the day, we ended up with the usual basket of impacts: increased temperature, increased variability in rainfall, sea level rise, and storm surges. And what we realized on the back of that particular analysis was that existing development problems were going to get worse, and there were going to be a whole new set of development problems coming into the mix. And so what we did, just purely out of common sense, because bear in mind at this time, we didn't even know that there was a difference between the term mitigation and adaptation. Just on a common sense basis, we decided new problems, you've got to respond to them. And totally unwittingly, we thereby made Durban one of the first cities around the world to lead with adaptation, not mitigation. You must remember local government's been engaged in climate protection work since about 1993. And the majority of that work has been mitigation. And while a lot of praise is now heaped upon our shoulders for being insightful and being aware of our context in Africa and so on, let me tell you, it made us an entire pariah. Our national government, in terms of its position in the UNFCCC negotiations, has a very strong mitigation platform. It, at that point, saw adaptation as a betrayal of that position, and I can remember not so long ago being virtually thrown out of a meeting with national government for suggesting that local government in Africa might have adaptation at the top of its agenda. It's made us a vast number of enemies amongst the technocrats who run with mitigation as their primary goal. But it's also given us an enormous platform for action. We've been able to use that prioritization of adaptation to put in place the Durban Adaptation Charter at COP17 and to begin rallying local government at an international level around the issues of adaptation. So what I want to do is tell you two stories now about the various adaptation facets that we've worked with. Our Municipal Climate Protection Program is essentially an adaptation program, and there are a number of focal points in it. And I'm going to talk to you about our municipal work and our community work. We decided once we had embraced this idea of adaptation that if we wanted others to embrace the idea, we would have to lead by example. So of course, what do? You want to lead by example. You want an integrated cross-sectoral strategy where you look for synergies. Are any of these terms familiar? Where you're looking for conflicts between them, and that's what we did. We looked at the various sectors, where they would be pressurized, what kind of adaptation options were out there for them, where could those be synergistic, and we produced this fabulous integrated cross-sectoral strategy. And quite frankly, it bombed. It was a failure. It was useless. The only movement it ever sees is when I dust that shelf in my office. And I think I'm the only person who's ever read it. And why was it such a failure? Well, for that sort of very excited moment when we ran out there to pursue integration, synergy, and all those wonderful things, we lost entire sight of the context within which we worked. And if we took off those glasses and looked around us, we were in a local government which had an organogram, only 50% capacity, so everyone was doing two jobs. Many people don't believe climate change exists. Many believe it's a Western conspiracy. Those who do believe it exists, like me, this is just not urgent enough to put to the top of the queue. Very few financial resources, massive loss of skills at the local government level. So under those sets of circumstances, you can't expect city officials who are under enormous political pressure from politicians to deliver development to embrace adaptation and run forth and integrate with everyone else. It just does not work. So we threw out the idea of integration in its entirety, and we said, let's get real. If we want anyone to embrace this, it's got to make sense within existing resources, within existing work plans, and we are going to adopt a sectoral approach. Oh, heretical thing, a sectoral approach. And so what we did is we decided to work in two initial sectors, water and health. Obviously, those are sectors that have some kind of political focus, so that was useful. There were sectors where we knew there were going to be climate change impacts, but most importantly, why did we choose those sectors? It's simply because I knew people in those sectors I could trust. So I knew I could bring them to a table, I knew they would listen to me, and I knew what response I would get from them would be a genuine response. So that was actually the underlying reason for going with those sectors. And so we proceeded with those sectors. We've since added disaster management, transport is getting added now. We're working in biodiversity. And we began working with those sectors around issues of climate change adaptation. And we realized very rapidly in that sectoral approach that we could not speak the language of those sectors. Engineers do not want to speak to environmentalists. Engineers want to speak to engineers. Social workers do not want to speak to environmentalists. They want to speak to social workers. So what we found we had to do was identify champions in those various sectors, build their capacity so that they could use the language of their sectors to take our message forward. But obviously there were some sectors where there were no obvious champions, and so we had to build them. So it was like social engineering. Who is the most likely champion? Can we put that person in a place where they will learn, where they will be able to share their ideas across a variety of scales? So we've constructed this network of champions. We haven't waited for them to emerge through some kind of spontaneous combustion. We've built them. But unfortunately, what we didn't realize, it's a bit like entering into a marriage. We kind of thought we'd run into the sector, you build the champion, and they'll go forth and do what they need to do. No, these sectoral champions are anticipating a long-term relationship with us. They want to keep working with us. And so we're having now to move to programmatic platforms of action that draw these sectoral champions together to address issues of common cause. So for us, the very interesting output is that we moved away from integration as process, and integration became a product of a sectoral process, which I think is quite interesting. And probably the most important take-home message for us from that process was very often the messenger is more important than the message. At the community-based level, a lot of our work has focused on biodiversity issues. My entire department is focused on biodiversity. And we are very concerned about biodiversity. Our city is located in one of the world's 34 global biodiversity hotspots. We believe that biodiversity is key to our adaptive capacity going forward, so we do a lot of work in terms of ecosystem management, ecosystem restoration. But you cannot pursue that biodiversity and climate agenda outside of the social agenda of our city. We are the poorest of the major metropolitan areas in South Africa. In many of the communities, we have unemployment levels of over 50%. So there's enormous social need. So you cannot pursue these other agendas outside of that social context. So we're constantly looking at ways of fusing those needs in some kind of meaningful way. At a variety of spots around the city, because of our obligations to offset vast carbon footprints from Seb Blatter and his crazy Football World Cup and COP17, I've got to rebuild vast forests, but that's useful from an adaptation point of view because I can do that to improve catchment management. And we're working together with a local NGO in a very interesting system of drawing in poor peri-urban and rural communities into that system, whereby unemployed members of those communities, so generally women and children, are taught to collect indigenous seed from remaining forest patches. They germinate those seeds at their homes. And then community facilitators who we train and capacitate to support our treepreneurs, not entrepreneurs, come, they measure the trees, count them, and they issue credit notes for trees. And those credit notes can be exchanged at tree stores. And when we started the program, we saw that people really, they wanted food and clothing, the basics. Now, as the program is maturing, they want building materials, they want water storage tanks, some are taking driving lessons to improve their skills base. So a real socioeconomic improvement in that set of circumstances. About a month ago, I went to visit a woman called Tandy, who's one of our key treepreneurs. She lives in a very poor peri-urban rural area, and she's just built a 6-bedroom house out of her tree credits. She's sending her 3 young daughters to better schools as a result. So we can see the socioeconomic improvements. But what was very interesting is because we'll be registering these products with the Climate Community and Biodiversity Alliance, is that we did a social impact assessment in 2010. And admittedly, that was very soon after the project started. But what it showed is that while communities were really benefiting from the project, they hadn't a clue why they were growing these trees, why they were planting them, why they were managing those trees when they were planted, despite the fact that we had embedded community facilitators, despite the fact that we used things like street theater, despite the fact that there were educational and training opportunities around climate change issues. So it was a real message about how many filters there are in between you and your message and perhaps the people that you need to be working with. And some of those filters, I think, for poor communities are just sheer desperation, the need to get from day to day. You know, climate change is not an issue. They've got more serious problems to deal with. But others are cultural filters. We've been working with another community. It's an informal or squatter settlement in a floodplain. They constantly have their houses washed away. They lose life and property. And we look at it and we see this informal settlement in a 100-year floodplain. And so we're talking to them about climate variability, increasing climate risk with climate change. And of course, as technocrats, we think, well, surely, we need to move these people out of danger's way. But their understanding of risk is entirely different. It has nothing to do with climate change. It has everything to do with Nkanyamba. Nkanyamba is a large flying snake in the sky, which is attracted to shiny surfaces because it's looking for the pond where its mate is. And wherever the Nkanyamba flies, it brings storms. So in fact, your risk management strategy in that community is not to think about leaving because it's very convenient to be there, but to cover your roof with black plastic so it doesn't shine because all the roofs are corrugated iron. So a very different risk management strategy. So important lessons about the kind of filters we have to work through when we're talking about transformation. So those are some of our stories. What kind of take-home messages do they leave us with? Well, first and foremost, it's not going to be better GCMs. It's not going to be bigger pipes. Much to my horror, it's not going to be better mangrove forests that are going to be the tools for transformation. It's going to be people. And people are, as my good friend Patty Romero-Lancau always says, they work in gray spaces. They're not black and white. They're chaotic. And they're incredibly messy to work with. And I think we often shy away from engaging with people at that level because of that messiness. The second important take-home message for us is that we can talk about stakeholders, but it's quite Orwellian. Some pigs are more equal than others. There are people who provide access points to systems. And if transformation, my good friend Mark over there talks about transformation as changes in political, cultural, institutional systems, the keys into those systems are often individuals. They're the little person behind the curtain controlling the levers, and you've got to be able to find them. And we found that without being able to find our various Wizard of Oz's in the various sectors, we can't move forward. And the final take-home message for us is that there is no silver bullet. I've just had to move office. And you know what moving office means? It means you kind of look at all your junk and you throw what you don't want away at long last. And I think I threw away somewhere between 30 to 50 guidebooks that have been thrown at me by UN Habitat, UNEP, various other United Nations organizations, ICLEI, all of which say, Debra, there is a recipe here, and if you follow it, you will be saved. I've never read one of them. So at the end of the day, we understand that transformation is probably made up of a lot of 10% solutions. There is no 100% solution that we're going to have to link together in quite a creative and changing way. So those are some of the stories I wanted to share with you, and hopefully it wasn't quite as boring as another PowerPoint.